All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. If you're gearing up for those UPSC mains, you know just how crucial it is to have a rock-solid grasp on international relations.
Absolutely.
And let's face it, 2024, well, that was a whirlwind year for India on the global stage. So today's deep dive is crafted specifically with you, our UPSC aspirants, in mind.
That's right.
We're going to unpack all of India's major foreign policy moves in 2024, and more importantly, what they signal for 2025. Get those notepads ready, folks, because this is packed with those high-yield concepts you need to ace those exams.
It really was a roller coaster year, especially right here in India's neighborhood. I mean, we saw unexpected political shakeups, diplomatic standoffs, simmering tensions, all while India is trying to carve out its own space in a really complex global landscape.
It's true, and I think for a lot of us, it felt like one big headline after another. I mean, just think about it. That surprise meeting between Modi and Xi Jinping after years of, well, let's call it frosty silence. And then that shocking assassination in Canada and the diplomatic fallout that followed. A total power shift in Bangladesh, not to mention Trump throws his hat back in the ring for the U.S. elections. Talk about a year, huh?
Yeah, it was a lot to keep up with. Where should we even begin?
Well, maybe a good starting point is how India managed to walk that diplomatic tightrope amidst some really major global conflicts this past year. I mean, you had the Russia-Ukraine war, the Israel-Gaza conflict, and India was calling for peace, but really steered clear of taking sides. What's your take on that?
It's a great point. You know, India really tried to maintain what we call strategic autonomy, sort of like that independent streak it's always been known for. So in 2024, we saw India advocating for peace, for sure, but very carefully avoiding picking sides in those conflicts.
Right. And wasn't there even speculation at one point that India might step in as a mediator, especially when PM Modi visited both Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, there was. Which would have been a pretty huge development for a country that's traditionally been non-aligned. But of course, that kind of maneuvering isn't without its risks, is it?
Definitely not. I mean, trying to stay neutral probably didn't win India many points with countries like the U.S. and Israel, who were, well, let's just say, pretty invested in those conflicts.
It's true, they were deeply involved. So it's this constant balancing act for India trying to forge its own path in a world where, frankly, the power dynamics are changing all the time.
Right, exactly. So we've got all this happening on the global stage, but let's zoom in a bit, closer to home. I mean, things weren't exactly calm in South Asia either, were they?
Not at all. I mean, 2024 was a roller coaster year for the region, starting with Bangladesh. When Sheikh Hasina, who had been a really close ally of India, was ousted from power, it really sent shockwaves through the region. It's created a lot of uncertainty and even fueled those concerns about rising anti-India sentiment there.
And then there was that whole situation in Canada, you know, those accusations about Indian involvement in that assassination. That was a bombshell that led to, what, a complete diplomatic freeze with Trudeau's government. Right?
Yeah. Really illustrates how sensitive diaspora politics can be, doesn't it? Canada's got a large and politically active Sikh population, which makes it a tricky situation for both India and Canada to navigate.
A diplomatic headache for sure.
Oh, absolutely.
But hey, it wasn't all doom and gloom, right? There were a few bright spots in the neighborhood too, weren't there?
There were. Relations with Sri Lanka and the Maldives actually improved after some earlier tensions. And of course, India's got that long-standing friendship with Bhutan, which remains strong.
Okay, so we've got global conflicts, we've got drama in the neighborhood, but now let's talk about the elephant in the room.
China? Can't avoid it, can we?
No, not really. Border tensions are, well, they never really go away completely, do they?
No, they don't. And those disengagement talks at the line of actual control, those are probably some of the toughest negotiations of the year, for sure. The border issue remains a major sticking point between the two countries.
But hold on, didn't we see Modi and Xi Jinping actually meet face-to-face this year at that BRICS summit? Everyone was saying that could be a sign of thawing relations maybe after those 2020 border clashes.
We did, and it was a big deal. I mean, it was their first interaction in 5 years. So yeah, it could signal a willingness to at least talk, maybe even try to find common ground.
Fingers crossed, right.
For sure. But we can't forget, China's influence is growing rapidly in the region, particularly in countries like Nepal. And that poses a real challenge for India's regional ambitions, no doubt about it.
It's a constant strategic chess match, isn't it? Always trying to anticipate that next move.
Always.
Speaking of complex relationships, let's turn to that U.S.-India partnership. How did that one fare in 2024?
Well, it was a bit of a roller coaster, to be honest. Remember all those legal troubles for the Adani group in the U.S.? And then those accusations against an Indian official in that alleged assassination plot? Those incidents definitely strained ties.
Yeah, they did. And then, bam, Trump's back in the White House.
Yeah.
And given his history of being, let's say, pro-India, I can only imagine that threw a wrench in a lot of predictions for 2025.
Oh, absolutely. Trump's return is a major wild card, and it has the potential to significantly reshape the U.S.-India relationship. But in what direction? Well, that's the big question mark, isn't it?
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already. Global conflicts, regional dynamics, power shifts. But for all of you out there aiming for those top ranks in the UPSC, we need to take this a step further, right? What does all of this actually mean for India's foreign policy going forward? What should we be watching for in 2025?
Great question. And I think if I were to put on my analyst hat here, mending fences with the U.S. under this new Trump administration, that's going to be right at the top of the agenda, especially with some pretty important events already lined up.
Oh, are you talking about things like President Trump possibly coming to India for that Quad summit, and then maybe a return visit by PM Modi to Washington?
Exactly. Those visits could be crucial in setting the tone for the relationship over the next 4 years. But there are other complexities at play, too. Take India's relationship with Iran, for example, especially in the realm of critical and emerging technologies. It's a delicate dance, given the tensions between Iran and, well, the whole U.S.-Israel alliance.
So India's trying to deepen ties with the U.S., but without completely alienating Iran. Tricky, tricky.
Very tricky.
And as if things weren't complicated enough, there are those high-profile visits from the Indonesian president and, oh yeah, maybe even Putin himself.
Right. 2025 is shaping up to be just as action-packed as 2024. I mean, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's going to be fascinating to watch it all unfold. Okay, UPSC aspirants. I know we threw a lot of information your way, but we're just getting started. When we come back, we'll dive into some of these key events and trends in more detail and really unpack what they mean for India's place on the world stage. Stay tuned. And hey, if you're finding this deep dive helpful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give us a like. It helps other UPSC hopefuls like you find us too.
Absolutely.
All right, on to part 2.
Okay, so let's jump back into that Modi-Xi meeting we were talking about earlier. It was a pretty big deal, right? I mean, their first face-to-face since those 2020 border clashes. Do you think it really signals a shift in that whole India-China dynamic, or are we maybe reading too much into it?
It's the question on everyone's mind, isn't it? On the surface, it seems positive, right? Like a willingness to at least, come to the table and talk.
Right.
But can we really trust China's intentions? I mean, especially when you look at how assertive they've been in the region.
Yeah, you've got to be cautious, that's for sure. I mean, it's definitely a step forward, no doubt about it. But we can't forget those disengagement talks at the LAC were tough, really tough. And China's influence in Nepal, those other neighboring countries, well, that's not going away anytime soon. It's a real concern for India.
It's like trying to navigate a minefield, isn't it?
Yeah, say that again.
Speaking of unpredictable landscapes, let's talk about the U.S.-India relationship. Trump's back in the Oval Office, and that's got to throw a whole new set of variables into the mix. How do you see this impacting things, especially with India?
Well, if we think back to Trump's first term, there was a pretty good rapport with India overall. He and PM Modi seemed to have a good personal connection, and there was a lot of talk about strengthening those strategic ties.
Howdy Modi in Texas, right? That was quite a spectacle, a real sign of the times.
Exactly. That event really drove home the importance both sides placed on that relationship. But let's not forget, there were some bumps in the road too, weren't there? Trade disputes, visa issues, those didn't just disappear overnight.
So there's potential for a reset, sure. But it's not all going to be smooth sailing.
Not necessarily, no.
Guess we'll have to wait and see how Trump 2.0 plays out on the world stage.
Exactly.
But what about the Quad? That strategic alliance with the U.S., Japan, and Australia. Where does that fit into all of this now?
The Quad definitely gained some serious momentum during Trump's first term, and I think his return could actually push it even further.
Really?
Yeah, it's seen as a counterbalance to China's growing influence in the Indo-Pacific, and that's a concern shared by all 4 countries.
But what about those tensions we saw between the U.S. and India in 2024? That whole Adani Group controversy and then that alleged assassination plot. Could that cast a shadow over things? Especially with Trump potentially going to India for the Quad summit.
It's possible, for sure.
Yeah.
But it's likely that both sides will try to downplay those issues and really focus on the bigger picture. I mean, the Quad has become too strategically important to let those controversies completely derail it.
So putting those differences aside and focusing on shared goals. All right, let's shift gears a bit and talk about a relationship that requires some very, very delicate diplomacy, India and Iran. With the U.S. trying to isolate Iran and India deepening its partnership with the U.S., it It seems like India's walking a tightrope here.
It really is. India's got these long-standing ties with Iran. I mean, historical, economic, and strategic.
Right.
But now, with India participating in that IC initiative with the U.S., the initiative on critical and emerging technology, it's creating some friction.
Right, because Iran sees that partnership as a potential threat,
Right.
right, to their own technological ambitions. So how does India even manage this without alienating either side? It seems like a real diplomatic puzzle.
It really is. It's about finding that sweet spot,
Yeah.
deepening cooperation with the U.S. in those key areas, but at the same time, keeping those lines of communication open with Iran. It's about balancing strategic interests with existing relationships. It's classic foreign policy dilemma, really.
And then, as if things weren't complicated enough, you've got these high-profile visits lined up for 2025. You've got the Indonesian president coming for Republic Day. And there are even whispers that Putin might make a trip to Delhi, his first since the Ukraine war started.
Wow. Really?
Yeah, it really highlights how much India's role on the world stage is growing, doesn't it?
It does. And each visit brings its own set of opportunities, right, to strengthen ties and advance those specific strategic goals.
A lot to juggle, that's for sure.
No doubt.
It seems like 2025 is shaping up to be just as, maybe even more dynamic and challenging than 2024.
You could say that again. Really highlights the need for India to be adaptable in its foreign policy approach. I mean, this isn't a static world. India has to be ready to navigate those twists and turns as they come.
All right, future diplomats. We've dissected some key events, looked at potential flashpoints, but for those UPSC mains exams, you've got to go beyond just knowing the facts. You need to be able to analyze, connect the dots, see the bigger picture.
Right. Think critically.
Exactly. So when we get back for the final part of our deep dive, that's exactly what we're going to do. We'll break down what all of this means for India's role on the global stage and how you can approach these topics strategically for your exams.
Sounds good.
Stay tuned.
And we're back. UPSC aspirants, welcome to the final part of our deep dive. We've spent the last two parts really breaking down all those major events and trends shaping India's foreign policy in 2024. Now let's zoom out a little bit, look at the bigger picture. What does all this mean for India's role in the world? And most importantly, how can you use this knowledge to ace those UPSC mains exams?
Absolutely. It's not just about knowing the facts, it's about being able to analyze them, dig deeper, and see how it all fits into India's strategic goals and the challenges it faces on the world stage.
So let's start with a big question. How has India's foreign policy approach evolved in recent years? What's changed and what's stayed the same? I think one of the biggest shifts we've seen is India becoming more assertive on the global stage. It's not just content with sitting back and being a participant anymore. India wants to shape the international order, advance its own interests. And we see this in its proactive diplomacy, engaging in things like the Quad, being willing to take a stand on those big global issues.
But even with this more assertive approach, India is still fiercely protective of its strategic autonomy, right?
Right. It doesn't want to be seen as aligning too closely with any one power or bloc.
So it's walking that tightrope.
Exactly. The term non-alignment might not be the official policy anymore, but the idea behind it, that strategic autonomy, it's still central to how India operates. India wants to build partnerships, sure, but partnerships based on mutual benefit without compromising its independence.
So how does all this play out in the real world? Can you give us an example?
Sure. Look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Even with all that pressure from the West, India chose not to outright condemn Russia's actions. It kept up those close ties with Moscow while also engaging with Ukraine, calling for peace. And this approach, well, it allowed India to do two things: maintain its long-standing relationship with Russia and uphold its commitment to dialogue and diplomacy.
So walking that tightrope, finding that balance. Now, what about the U.S.-India relationship? How has that evolved under PM Modi, especially now with Trump back in the White House?
Yeah, no doubt about it. The U.S.-India partnership has deepened in recent years. A lot of it is driven by those converging strategic interests, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. We've seen more cooperation on defense, trade, technology, even intelligence sharing, and of course the Quad is a big part of that.
But we also talk about some of those friction points, those disagreements over trade, the Adani Group issue. How do you see those playing out, especially now with Trump back in the mix?
It's important to remember that no relationship is perfect, right? Every partnership has its ups and downs. The key is to manage those differences and not let them derail the whole relationship. I think both India and the U.S. have a vested interest in a strong partnership, and they'll likely find ways to work through those issues.
Finding that common ground.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's shift focus a bit and talk about India's immediate neighborhood. South Asia, What are some of the big challenges and opportunities India faces there?
South Asia is really crucial for India, right? It's at
Mhm.
the core of its security and economic interests. Any kind of instability in the region has a direct impact on India.
And we saw that play out in 2024, the political turmoil in Bangladesh, those accusations about India's involvement in that assassination in Canada, and China's growing influence in Nepal. It's a lot to deal with. How should India approach all these challenges?
I think it's going to take a multi-pronged approach. First, India needs to strengthen those partnerships it has with countries like Bhutan, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, build those economic and security ties. Second, India needs to engage with countries like Nepal and Bangladesh, where China is becoming more influential. And finally, it needs to be ready to handle those potential security threats coming from Pakistan and Afghanistan.
So a delicate balance of diplomacy, economic engagement, strategic planning. It's complex. As we wrap up our deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways for you, our dedicated UPSC aspirants? What are the things you absolutely need to remember for your exams?
Here are a few things I'd highlight. First, really understand what drives India's foreign policy, its strategic interests, its values, its history. Second, be able to look at current events and see how they connect to India's foreign policy goals. Third, really get a deep understanding of those complex relationships India has with other countries and regions. And finally, be ready to share your own informed views on the challenges and opportunities India faces in the world.
Some excellent advice for our future diplomats and policymakers. And remember, this deep dive, it's just the beginning. Keep digging into these topics. Read, stay informed, and most importantly, develop those critical thinking skills.
Couldn't agree more. The world of international relations never stands still. To succeed, especially in those UPSC exams, you've got to be constantly learning and evolving.
Absolutely. And with that, we'd like to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into India's foreign policy landscape. We hope you found it helpful, especially as you prepare for those UPSC exams. If you did, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. It really helps us reach more UPSC aspirants like you. Until next time, best of luck with your studies and your journey towards shaping India's future in the world.